You want to invite? Right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. 15 minutes here is a short time before we go on to the next session. It is my absolute pleasure to invite Pak Tom up on stage again for a very casual conversation to take off from where he left. So, little known fact, when I was in Indonesia leading a US MNC for almost 3 years, we worked together, Pak Tom, right?
And it was such a pleasure.
Indeed, it was.
Extremely productive.
Absolutely. And, we went to the World Economic Forum together and a lot of other things. But coming back to why we're here today,
yes,
Malaysia, at the heart of digital ASEAN. What do you feel about that coming from Indonesia?
I was just chatting with some of our colleagues, right? And it really does feel like Malaysia is currently the best kept secret in the region, right? I think, as I mentioned earlier, Singapore's done a phenomenal job. Characteristically enough, Indonesia's gotten a lot of attention, but Malaysia hasn't yet, right? So Malaysia, to me, today, feels like Indonesia maybe 4 or 5 years ago, right? Like Malaysia is the one place which currently, at this moment, has enormous upside. Yeah. As I alluded in my remarks just now, if anything, Indonesia kind of had its climax, peaked, and frankly, a few of our unicorns have IPO'd, and the share price is down significantly. Our biggest unicorn, our biggest decacorn, Gojek, now known as Go2 because they merged with Tokopedia. They IPO'd like 6 months ago, 8 months ago, but the date to watch is December 1 of this year, which is when Gojek's lockup expires, right? So right now, Indonesia sort of seen its peak. We're going through a bit of a rough time. And I think this is an opportunity for Malaysia to raise its hand and really promote what it has to offer, which I think is quite unique and strongly complementary with what Singapore and Indonesia have to offer.
So just taking a lead from what you said, if we're looking at investment flows around the world, especially over the last 1 year, or more so over the last 6 months, big events happening across the globe, right? Report from McKinsey came out just recently to talk about data flows and investment flows coming out of Europe because of the situation between Russia and Ukraine. We're looking at China and the zero COVID policy, and it's still under a lockdown, right? Travel restrictions possibly going to be lifted sometime soon. We look at what happened in Sri Lanka, and so all of this global sort of events have a very clear impact on supply chain. And when that happens, then investment flows or investments are reallocated, right? So you talk about a Europe plus one strategy or a China plus one strategy. What are your views in terms of ASEAN as a bloc, if I can call it a bloc, or countries such as Malaysia, to put ourselves right in the middle of that conversation about investment flows and supply chain? What can we do better, you think?
Absolutely. So we already mentioned that, remarkably enough, for a region that is chronically underestimated by the rest of the world. Today, ASEAN literally is like an oasis of stability compared to so many other regions racked by inflation, energy crisis, war, right? But the one thing we can now do to seize this moment, to really maximize, to really capitalize on this moment, is to speed up internal integration among us. To speed up ASEAN integration. You mentioned, Ray, that we've been to Davos together a few times, right? Of course, I meet multinational companies, investors, and one common complaint is that investing in ASEAN, you still have cross-border customs checks. You still have goods, components, raw materials stuck in ports, right? You still have non-harmonized tax policies or even on data policy is not completely harmonized, right? That is certainly one advantage that China has, right? Like components, raw materials going from Guangdong to Shanghai don't have to go through customs checks, don't have to go through incompatible, product safety standards and the like, right? So I think because right now we're succeeding, like right now we're not in a crisis, right now we're riding high. It's a time to muster the political will, right? Because the public will be behind us, right? The public will be supportive. We have to ride the wave. Don't wait until the wave has crashed. Don't wait until we're back in crisis, right? But let's take advantage of this positive momentum to finally break down the barriers that are holding us back.
I think that's a really good point. 660 million population, digitally savvy, mostly young, relatively, still growing at a rate of about 5.4% for this year, right? So given the turbulence that's going on, we're still, like you said, an ocean of stability. But the intra-ASEAN trade is still a problem, right? Like e-commerce clearance of goods, mobility of talent is another one, right? And flow of capital. How can we break down some of that silence? Because the frameworks are there. The ASEAN Digital Master Plan is there.
Yes.
Right? The FTAs are in place, right? We've got the RCEP in place. Political will aside, what else can we do to ensure that these flows, mobility of talent, mobility of funds within ASEAN,
right?
So that we look at the oasis or as the oasis for investments?
Well, you just closed off my escape hatch, Ray, because you said political will aside, because that was going to be my answer, right?
I mean, it has to be political will.
There has to be political will, and I'll come back to that, actually. Well, look, thanks to social media, right? Thanks to the internet, the bottom-up power of the people is unprecedented. Yeah. So ultimately, politicians follow the public, right? So the more the public engages in cross-border activity, the more the public makes friends across borders, within ASEAN. The more, Filipinos, Thais, Malaysians, Indonesians, of all 10, citizens of all 10 ASEAN countries, the more we meet in massively online video games, right? The more we participate in each other's singing contests, like the more bottom-up, like people-to-people activity there is, mark my words, politicians will notice, and politicians will follow the trend, right? To build on the previous panels, right? So Lord Vasey mentioned about ambition. I mentioned about sincerity and consistency, right? But ultimately, the next level to that is really the spirit, right? Basically, the most fundamental, right, person to person, like sense of community, right, friendship, and excitement.
And so more events such as this, I think, and inviting each of us to more of these regional conferences, I think will play a greater role. I want to go back to something you said earlier on in terms of 50 unicorns you said in Indonesia.
15
unicorns, right? What's really important, I think for me, my point is, are we looking at valuation or value creation? So you're saying that look at the lockup period and then look at what happens to Go 2, right? Or even if you look at Grab right now, right? So when we talk about unicorns, now is that really what ASEAN should be aiming for, the churning of more unicorns because they are valuation driven or more value creation driven?
So that is a perfect example of where Malaysia has an opportunity today, right? You're not going to have quite the same hangover that we're going to have in Indonesia. Yeah. So again, Indonesia probably is like at the forefront of a bit of a unicorn bubble, right? And I can tell you, with rapidly rising interest rates, a lot of these unicorns are getting marked down. Yeah? So we're going to have 1 to 2 years of severe hangover in Indonesia, right? And Singapore being a hub is not going to be immune to that, right? Singapore is where C and Grab are headquartered, and both those companies have their share prices seen going down 75%, right, in like 8 months. Now, my idea for Malaysia is that, you know, you can be the steady as she goes, right? So we were sort of the rabbit. You can be the tortoise, right? Focus on demonstrating you had the perfect phrase, Ray. Focus on demonstrating concrete and real value creation as opposed to bubble era valuation, right? I mean, I've always been a big admirer of Malaysia's technocratic excellence, right? Of the highly developed civil service, right? Of your professional class, right? Maybe in Indonesia we have more flamboyance, we have more flair, right? But I've always looked at Malaysia as being sort of quietly competent, right? I mean, you have by far the largest semiconductor industry in ASEAN, right? And very quietly, Intel announced they're putting like another $10 billion into Malaysia, right? So I think I see Malaysia as the sort of quiet overachiever, right? I mean, you're building real value, you're attracting concrete FDI, right? Potentially less speculative capital and more real FDI.
So I think part of that is also to build very strong infrastructure in place, enablers in place, right? Submarine cables, data centers, connectivity, right? I think these are critical things that we need to put into place. But however, like you said, the harmonization of that throughout ASEAN perhaps is quite patchy, if I can say that, right? And the regulatory framework to put this across ASEAN is also not quite there yet, right? So how do we work together to ensure that, for example, connectivity of sub-cables, data centers, there seems to be a huge interest of data centers in Malaysia right now, for reasons we know in Indonesia or in Singapore, right? What are views towards getting the infrastructure, digital infrastructure in ASEAN sorted out? Will it take, you know, what kind of investments are required? Do we leave it to the private sector to drive it? What are your views on that?
So just now I talked about the bottom-up people power, right? Influencers, citizens, small, medium enterprises, right? Actively promoting on social media, right? The infrastructure requirements that you just outlined, Ray, are really more the domain of large enterprises. Yeah. And there, I think we need more B2B engagement. So I had the good fortune of being invited to 3 conferences in a row in Singapore 2 weeks ago during their famous Formula One week. And it was astonishing because a veritable who's who of business across ASEAN, from Philippines, from Thailand, from Indonesia, you know, from Malaysia, were all in Singapore, reconnecting in person for the first time in 2 years, right? And what was also very striking to me, Ray, is there's a very palpable generational transition happening in the largest business groups in ASEAN, right? Whether it's Lucio Tan Group or Sinar Mas Group in Indonesia, or Salim Group, or you know, some of the big Singaporean companies. On stage, center stage, were the 3rd generation, were younger, the next generation, right? And I know their parents very, very well because of previous student government. So after the 1997-1998 financial crisis, she had a stint in our bank rescue agency, which I think in Malaysia you had something called Dana Harta, right? And so I was in the Indonesian version of that. Yeah. So I worked with their parents after the Asian financial crisis, restructuring these conglomerates and bringing them back out of bankruptcy, right? I can tell you this younger generation is like night and day compared to the parents. They're so much more progressive, they're so much more internationalized, they're so much more digitalized, they're digital natives, right? And I think we're going to have the intrinsic passion among the business community in ASEAN to drive the infrastructure build-out. The next phase, I believe, is that we need to drive the cross-border friendships among these tycoons, right? Like the Filipinos and Indonesians, the family offices, yes, the Malaysians with Indonesians. So it's already happening, but I think that's going to be crucial, to knitting together the infrastructure and the corporate sectors of the biggest companies across ASEAN.
Great, and on that note, I've been reminded that we've come to the end of our session. We have to continue over lunch. I'll have to hand it over to the next session. Very insightful as usual, but Tom, great to see you again. It's unfortunate you're leaving so soon, but I'll be in Indonesia soon enough to see you there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ray.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Raymond, Siva. Of course, thank you, Pat Thomas. I love his last line, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, I'll be back. Just to wrap things up for this particular session, I love how Pat Thomas has put it so succinctly. The number one barrier is actually red tape when we talk about inter and intra-ASEAN trade, in terms of matching benchmarks, matching standards, and so using Web3, especially empowered by tech, to decentralize, to make things transparent, secure, and also machine learning for better efficiency and maximizing profit. But the biggest takeaway for me for this session is Pat Thomas's simile, the rabbit versus the tortoise. So instead of bubble bursting evaluations, he stated that Indonesia is, of course, riding this crest. Malaysia instead is the tortoise, slow and steady, strong core fundamentals. That's the attractive factor. We are competent, we are shy. So ladies and gentlemen, here's a fair warning. If we don't start talking about us, somebody else will. Just like how Singapore started talking about nasi lemak before us. So, Malaysians, time to rise up and take the initiative. Thank you very much. To Singaporeans in the room, I apologize, but at the same time, truth is truth, after all.